For those of you who don't know us, and this is your first exposure to FPRI, we're the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We are a think tank in Philadelphia. And in addition to holding events like this, we regularly publish insights, reports, and short pieces on our website, which is fpri.org, which I encourage you all to go take a look at. Without further ado, I want to turn the floor over to our two panelists because they are what you all have tuned in to see. I will introduce them first, and then I will turn it over to Susannah first, followed by Ankit. And then they will each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, give or take. And then we will move towards the moderated discussion phase of this panel. We do encourage moderated discussion. It's far more interesting when you ask lots of questions. You keep me on my toes, and I will moderate each question. We've all been in the pandemic now for, I guess, 1.5 years, but for those who may be their first Zoom event, the way that we do this is if you look at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom, there is the Q&A function. If you type it in there, I will follow along, I will curate, and I will pose the questions. If there are any problems with your Q&A function, it happens from time to time, you can directly type into the chat and I will be checking that as well. Not as much as the Q&A function, but definitely coming back and forth to that. So without further ado, we have two panelists today, both experts in their own right. First, we have Ankit Panda. He's the Stanton Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment's Nuclear Policy Program. And we have Susannah Patton, who's a research fellow at the Foreign Policy and Defense Program at the United States Study Center. So with that, Susannah, the floor is yours for opening remarks, and Ankit, I'll come to you next. So please take it away.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you to the Foreign Policy Research Institute for hosting this event, and also for doing so a little bit after the dust has settled on the AUKUS announcement, which I think is really great. So what I want to cover in my presentation is, I think, 3 important questions from Australia's perspective. The first is, what does AUKUS say about Australia's strategic circumstances? The second is, from Australia's perspective, what does AUKUS say about US commitment to Australia and to Asia? And the third is, what does AUKUS say about the future strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific? So I'll go first to this question around Australia's strategic circumstances. And I think I'll open by saying that the most surprising and interesting element of the AUKUS announcement is not really that Australia wanted this technology. It's more about the fact that the US agreed to Australia's request for technology sharing. So Australia has for some time seen that its regional security environment has deteriorated quite sharply. And a key piece of context here is the Australia-China bilateral relationship, which has really gone downhill over recent years. There's been no ministerial contact, so no top-level political contact between the two countries for the better part of 2 years. Australia has been subject to economic coercion. And in the background to all of that, of course, China has been engaged in a rapid military modernization. So those factors have combined, I think, to really sharpen Australia's threat perceptions about China. And last year, Australia issued a really important policy statement called the Defence Strategic Update, which said a number of important things quite clearly about the way Australia saw the region going. It said that the risk of high-intensity conflict, though still low, had increased, and as a result, Australia needed to develop a more capable military force and adopt a more assertive regional role, and to work with the United States and with other partners to strengthen collective deterrence. So in many ways, this, I think, should be seen as the kind of substantive foreshadowing of the AUKUS arrangement, and there are some real points of continuity with Australian strategic policy that my colleague Ashley Townsend and others have written about, that really go to the fact that Australia has wanted better access to US defence technology for quite some time, and has also wanted to establish more collective arrangements for regional security. So the idea that the United States is no longer the regional or even the global hegemon. And so allies like Australia need to play a much more active role. And that's something that Australia has been very upfront in saying, even in the US context. A couple of years ago, Australia's defence minister visited Washington, and she made some very frank comments, which were along the lines that no one country, not even the United States, can maintain deterrence alone. And so I think that clear shift in Australia's thinking, that Australia needs to step up and do more, and that it would need to be more capable, has been there for quite some time. And the AUKUS arrangement is really part of that. So the second question that I mentioned I would touch on is around the US role in the region. And I'll kind of give an Australian perspective on that, I think, because from Australia's perspective, the most important question when we look to the United States and our relationship and our alliance is really the US commitment to Asia going forward. The key question for Australia is really how the US will remain committed to a balancing role that's going to serve Australia's interests, and how effective it will be at pulling other important countries into that kind of balancing coalition. So Australia has sought for a long time now to embed the US role in the region. So on the defence side, through initiatives like the Force Posture announcement in 2011, that Marines would be based in Darwin on a rotational basis. Now through the new announcements that were recently made bilaterally between Australia and the United States, and of course trilaterally through AUKUS. And on the diplomatic side, there has been a similar effort, which has really been around entrenching the US role in regional diplomatic architecture like APEC, like the East Asia Summit. But of course, 10 years after President Obama announced the rebalance, there are good reasons why countries like Australia, I think, why there is skepticism in some quarters about the US commitment to the region and also its ability to craft coalitions. Until the AUKUS announcement, there wasn't really a lot of evidence that the Biden administration, despite all its Asia expertise, all the normalcy that it brought back to US foreign policy, was really focused enough on the Indo-Pacific. And there was a strong sense that it didn't seem to recognize the urgency of the regional challenge. I think what is really positive about the AUKUS arrangement is firstly that the US has taken a significant step to empower an ally like Australia, but also that some of the language that we heard from the administration, including from President Biden at the time of the announcement, was really, in my view, the first time that we really heard strong language around the urgency of the challenge in the Indo-Pacific and the need to do something different to compete with China there. Previously, a lot of what we heard from the US administration was really conceiving of competition with China as a much more global long-term endeavour, rather than something that was most urgent and most tightly focused in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think AUKUS does give a positive signal. But of course, that's a long-term endeavour, and we're yet to see whether it will pay off. But it goes with another really recently positive signal, which is the convening of the Quad as a leaders level group. Now, of course, the Quad is not a defence forum. It's a very different type of arrangement to AUKUS, but nonetheless, I think like AUKUS, it also demonstrates that the US is able to do new things, new and different things. Many doubted that the Quad would ever be sustained to the point that it would meet at the leaders level, that it would have such a diverse agenda as it now does. And I think that also gives a strong boost to the idea that the United States is capable of the statecraft that is required in the Indo-Pacific region. But of course, gaps still remain, especially on the economic side in terms of US engagement. So that leads me to my third question, which is, what does the AUKUS arrangement say about future regional dynamics in Asia? And this is not really about cause or effect at this point, because we're yet to see what will truly come about from AUKUS, but more about the reactions to AUKUS and what they tell us about the current dynamic. In my view, and I think this reflects a general sort of prioritization that a lot of policymakers and experts in Australia would have, Southeast Asia is really critical to the regional dynamic going forward. But what we're really seeing with reactions to AUKUS is the kind of emergence of a sort of two-track region, where you see on the one hand Australia and some other countries that are really fully paid up members of what looks to be an emerging US-led balancing coalition in Asia. But many other countries in the region, especially in Southeast Asia, are not interested in and may never be interested in joining such a coalition. And that really explains why a couple of important countries in Southeast Asia have been very publicly hesitant about the arrangement. So Indonesia and Malaysia in particular have voiced concerns that the AUKUS arrangement actually increases regional tensions, contributes to the idea of a military buildup, and makes conflict more likely. Now, seen from, I think, either a US or an Australian perspective, that kind of view is really, in some ways discombobulating because, of course, China is launching new ships, has its own fleet of nuclear submarines. And so the idea that, that a country like Australia is contributing to those tensions is quite difficult to come at, but I think it's really important to understand that that those perspectives that really hold both the US and China as being responsible for a deteriorating regional environment, those perspectives are real, and I think that it poses a challenge for how the US and Australia engage with those kind of swing countries, if you like, that are going to be quite crucial in the evolving dynamic of competition between the US and China in the region. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you, Aaron.
Thank you. That was quite interesting. Ankit, over to you. And please, if you have questions, now's the time to start dropping in the chat. So go ahead, Ankit, go ahead.
All right, great. Thanks, Aaron. And thanks to FPRI for having me here today to talk a little bit about AUKUS. Let me echo Susannah's thanks for holding this event a few weeks after the dust has settled. I would argue that the dust is going to be settling on this for the next 18 months or so, as the details, particularly of the nuclear propulsion submarine program, are hammered out. But let me begin by reflecting a little bit on the debate around AUKUS in these first 3 weeks. It's been interesting and really stark to me to sort of see three camps coalesce, more or less. On the one hand, you have sort of the folks that are coming at this from the perspective of Indo-Pacific statecraft and grand strategy. I think Susannah did an excellent job of laying out the perspectives there on why this will be a complement to Australia's autonomous capability to become a more capable defense partner in the Indo-Pacific region, and how the United States is signaling through a very costly signal here, technology sharing, particularly high technology nuclear propulsion. And by the way, it's not just submarines we're talking about, right? We're talking about long-range strike, Tomahawks, JASSM ERs, long-range anti-ship missiles, cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum technologies. So there's a lot here on that front. So that's the first camp that I've noticed coalesce, and I think Susannah really walked us through the set of arguments there. The other two that I'll try to speak to a little bit more are, on the one hand, the sort of non-proliferation perspective here. And it is, even though the submarines are sort of a long-term capability and not something that's going to manifest in the next few years, it is something that has drawn quite a bit of discussion, at least here in the United States and in certain capitals overseas, where there are concerns over what this means for the non-proliferation regime at large. And then finally, there's a defense industrial politics perspective around all of this, specifically around the domestic politics in Australia of a home-based sort of construction project for a submarine, which was a big part of the original Collins class replacement competition back in 2015, 2016, but also about just the feasibility of this project and when these capabilities will manifest, what kind of SSN we're likely to see the Royal Australian Navy operate down the line in the 2040s. So I'll try to speak a little bit to that. So AUKUS is about submarines, while it's also about a lot of these other things. The submarines have drawn a lot of the attention. I think a big part of that has been the dramatic rift between the French and the Anglo alliance here on the advisability of AUKUS as an enterprise. So the submarines as the crown jewel, I do think deserve a significant bit of attention, because that is primarily what a lot of folks are focusing on to convey the benefits primarily of the agreement. Now, there are basically two templates here for what the Australians might end up acquiring. On the one hand, you have the US Virginia class, and on the other hand, you have the UK's Astute class attack submarines. Both are nuclear propulsion attack submarines. There are slight variations in their size, total armament, and as a result of the difference in size, also their speed. My sense is that it is overwhelmingly likely that Australia will end up going with the Astute class. I'll just briefly speak to why I believe that. Probably there's a lower unit cost associated with the Astute class, probably fewer legal obstacles associated with Australia procuring the Astute class, primarily with reducing the implications here in the United States for congressional involvement, ironing out all the details under the Atomic Energy Act. The Astute class may actually offer a slightly higher speed as a result of its lower total displacement size. And the downside there is that Astute will offer less in the way of total armament, but speed may be important for the Royal Australian Navy, given the vast distances in the Indo-Pacific. Imagine that these submarines will be home ported in Perth, for instance, surveying important sea lanes in the Indian Ocean region, having the ability to get your submarine to the region quicker, and then using that endurance time to really monitor and carry out operations there could be quite valuable. So those are some of the reasons that, I think I haven't actually seen too much on the debate so far about the differences between the Astute and the Virginia, but I thought I'd sort of emphasize that because I do think that's important. And that's really, where we get into the defense industrial politics debate around this, is that we're having this debate at a time when there's very little known about how exactly all of this is going to work in practice, including on the non-proliferation side. Those discussions have started. US, UK, and Australian officials have begun conversations with the IAEA in Vienna about this arrangement. And so let me use that then as a segue to talk a little bit about the non-proliferation significance of this arrangement, first of all. So the only states that operate nuclear propulsion submarines are the 5 nuclear weapon states in the Non-Proliferation Treaty and India, which is a non-signatory to the NPT. Brazil is developing a nuclear propulsion submarine capability using low enriched uranium. And the Brazilians did consider using highly enriched uranium. And that distinction does matter because in the case of the United States and the UK, the only kind of naval propulsion reactors that the two countries have to offer, and as a result, the only kind of nuclear fuel they can offer Australia, is highly enriched uranium. Both the US and the UK use uranium enriched to 93.5% weapons grade by any measure to operate their nuclear propulsion submarines. By some estimates, the US Navy alone uses 100 nuclear weapons worth of highly enriched uranium to sustain its total fleet of nuclear propulsion vessels. That's surface warships and submarines included. So the big non-proliferation concern here is not that Australia will use this SSN capability to covertly pursue a nuclear weapon. And I really want to emphasize that because most of the justifications that we've heard so far from the Australian government are really emphasizing Australia's excellent non-proliferation credentials. I think there's very little to dispute there. I don't think anybody, if you sat me down and you forced me to pick an American treaty ally in the Indo-Pacific to sell SSNs to, I would probably go with Australia from a non-proliferation perspective, right? But I do want to emphasize why these concerns still matter and why they deserve to be taken seriously by the administration here, by the Australian government, by the UK, by the IAEA. And that's really about the precedent this sets for the non-proliferation regime at large. So submarines are, broadly speaking, becoming a more valuable perceived capability by a lot of militaries. And that's especially true in the Indo-Pacific, especially true in Southeast Asia in particular, and not that any of these countries are looking at nuclear propulsion technologies at the moment, but the issue again is technology sharing. The United States has really fought tooth and nail over the last several decades to keep nuclear propulsion technology out of the hands of other countries, with the exception of the UK, with whom we have an agreement going back to the late 1950s to share this technology, around concerns about the safeguarding of nuclear fuel. And this gets very wonky, and I'm happy to get into the details in the Q&A. But broadly speaking, there is something of a loophole in the international safeguard systems established by the NPT that allows for naval nuclear fuel to be excluded from traditional safeguards, which the IAEA, of course, verifies, makes sure that all NPT non-nuclear weapon states aren't diverting fuel to use in weapons. So the precedent now, and this is where I think I'm waiting for further details, is are the United States, Australia, and the UK going to use AUKUS as a way in which to strengthen the non-proliferation regime. And I think there's an opportunity there. Australia, for instance, could voluntarily cooperate with the IAEA, go above and beyond its obligations to demonstrate additional transparency and really help the international community here come up with a system to verify the use of nuclear fuel on nuclear submarines. And of course, I think if we sort of zoom out and we reflect on AUKUS's fundamental raison d'etre, which is protecting the so-called liberal international order, rules-based order, whatever you're going to call it, I think it's incumbent on us to also recall that the non-proliferation regime is a very important part of that order. So while the happiest consequence here from a non-proliferation perspective might have been Australia continuing with its plan to procure conventional submarines, there is another way to make this have a happy ending, in my opinion. Those details will have to be hammered out, though. But I do want to sort of emphasize that these debates that the non-proliferation community has been highly concerned about in the last few weeks, will be a long-running part of this. So let's go back now to, actually, before I move on, another reason I think to take this seriously is that the Chinese reaction so far has really been to hammer home how terrible of a development this is for the non-proliferation regime. I think, of course, those arguments aren't being made in good faith. But I think if AUKUS really, I think, does proceed without seriously taking these concerns on, I think that would be a mistake. I don't think it's likely that the Australian submarine will use low-enriched uranium. Just ironically speaking, I mean, the French would have been probably the ones to offer that, given that France does operate and offer that technology. But of course, we're past that at this phase. So let me now talk a little bit about some of the costs of AUKUS. And I think this is where really the debate kind of cleaves more broadly, which is that on the one hand, we're assessing a future conventional deterrence capability against a range of costs that I think are more immediately perceptible. And I think the theory of the case for things like the non-proliferation consequences, the cost to the relationship with France, not only for Australia, but also the UK and the US, the consequences for alliance management more broadly in the Indo-Pacific, I think do deserve a little bit of attention here. So let's talk a little bit about France. The US-French relationship, of course, I think has been through an unprecedentedly rocky period in the last few weeks, and I think that's really underemphasizing things. I do think that we'll be able to repair the relationship with France, but the broader consequence here is about the debates that are happening within Paris, or at least in the French strategic community, on France's role in the Indo-Pacific, where you've had sort of two sort of poles in that debate. On the one hand, you have sort of the traditional strategic autonomy Gaullist trend in French thought, which is that France really needs to be its own power. France emphasizes that it's a resident power in the Indo-Pacific with a larger exclusive economic zone than any American ally in the region, including the United States. And as a result, the French have really tried to make the case that what they bring to the region is something that deserves to be taken seriously on its own merits. On the other hand, you do have a strand of French thought that's more transatlantic, more internationalist, fundamentally more interested in coalition building with the United States. And those thinkers, I think, have taken it on the chin here with the AUKUS announcement, which is that the case here has become a lot stronger now for the pro-strategic autonomy case. The long-term consequences of this, I think, are to be determined. I think if I had to bet, I think strategic realities will ultimately pull France back towards the US coalition here that's being built in the Indo-Pacific. But these consequences, again, I think do need to be considered as part of this. Let me move on now to alliance management in Asia. Now, it's no secret to any US ally that the US doesn't really treat all of its allies equally. I think what we've seen here with AUKUS is indeed evidence, as Susannah said, of the United States making an important long-term bet on Australia, really indicating the historic nature of that relationship, the closeness between the three countries who collaborate on intelligence sharing as members of the Five Eyes, for instance. But this will raise questions, for instance, in Japan and South Korea, where there's certainly been an interesting debate in the aftermath of the AUKUS announcement about what the United States should be doing to improve their autonomous defense capabilities. Because the broader context here in the Indo-Pacific, as Susannah hinted, is that the United States recognizes that the future of the Indo-Pacific cannot only be in Washington's hands. So there's been a concerted effort to improve the capabilities of allies across the board. It's not just AUKUS, albeit AUKUS has certainly been the highest profile agreement in this nature. But we can just look at the scrapping of the revised missile guidelines with South Korea earlier this year as another example. Longer term trends going back to 2015 with Japan. which crystallized in Japan's own 2018 National Defense Program Guidelines, which are very similar in many ways to Australia's 2020 Defense Strategic Update in terms of the Japanese assessment for high-intensity conflict in the region. And so now, of course, unsurprisingly, we've heard renewed discussion of nuclear propulsion technology in Japan and South Korea, where there is a bit of interest in the recent prime ministerial contest within the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan. Every major frontrunner candidate supported the notion of a Japanese nuclear propulsion capability, for instance. The United States, and if you read the AUKUS joint statements, you read the remarks from President Biden, for instance, you do see that the United States is trying to be very clear that AUKUS is very much an exception, an exceptional agreement for Australia, but there will, I think, be a stronger demand signal from other allies for additional technology sharing in the future. And so let me just end a little bit by talking about some of the other consequences. I was going to get into the regional reaction, but Susannah covered that, so I'm not going to go into that. Longer term, I think we're looking at a capability here with the submarines that's really going to come into fruition in the early 2040s at the earliest, miraculously in the late 2030s, although I don't think anyone's seriously expecting that. So if I had sort of a recommendation, I guess, for the foreign policy community really thinking about AUKUS is to focus on some of the non-submarine capabilities, which are really likely to manifest much sooner. Things like Australian long-range strike capabilities, precision-guided missiles for coastal defense, those capabilities are likely to arrive in Australia much sooner. Australia will be setting up a sovereign guided missile production capability. The other parts of the technology sharing cooperation between the three countries are also likely to see significant, I think, advancement within the 2020s and the early 2030s. And some of those capabilities, I think, ultimately will be what we end up talking a lot about. AUKUS in many ways reminds me of the India deal, which of course was, and I think there's a lot of similarities there, including how it was conducted within the interagency in the US government. The sense I get with AUKUS is that this was a highly secretive, small group of people, fundamentally, I think primarily at the National Security Council, stewarding this effort, and then ultimately it seeped out into the interagency to manage the fallout with France, the non-proliferation consequences, and so forth. And of course, I think something I'll just end with on AUKUS and the comparison with the India agreement was that with the India deal, you had sort of the booster case and sort of the pessimistic case, and neither of which really came to pass, right? The India deal wasn't the end of the non-proliferation regime as we knew it, but it also wasn't sort of the birth of a new US-India sort of fundamental partnership to balance China. I mean, granted, relations have gotten closer, but of course, there are a lot of difficulties there. And let's not even get into the extent to which the India deal actually helped India acquire US or French nuclear reactors. Of course, that hasn't happened just yet. And so when we think about AUKUS, then the question here is that I don't know. I'll be probably a very different kind of person by the time the first Royal Australian submarine enters the waters of the Indo-Pacific. But I do think the case right now for AUKUS being fundamentally revolutionary is, I think, limited in my opinion. But that said, it's also unlikely to be sort of the death knell for non-proliferation or lead to a cascade of naval nuclear propulsion technologies proliferating. But in a sense, I think these costs need to be fundamentally contended with. And so while there is, I think, a strong case here for helping Australia resist Chinese coercion and develop its autonomous capabilities, I think it's also important to be clear about the extent of costs here. Aaron, I think I'll end it there. Looking forward to the discussion.
Well, great. We're right at the half hour, so we have half an hour for moderated discussion. We already have 4 questions. I'd encourage you to ask more, but I'm going to, 2 of our attendees preempted a question that I was going to prompt both of you with, and I'm going to combine 2, one by Charles and one by Hal Scott Davis. It's putting the duration, and Ankit, you just talked about the duration of the submarine portion of this agreement in context. So can you talk a little bit about the tensions over Taiwan, which we're seeing every single day, right? Over I don't know, I don't want to use the word intrusion, but let's say the ADIZ issues. The concerns, particularly here in the US and perhaps in Australia, about a Chinese move on Taiwan, and then how the tail end of this of the submarine agreements, or at least the submarine MOU, plays into that. So can you talk a little bit about how they're related, if at all? Susannah, maybe go first, and I'll come back to Ankit.
Sure. Well, I think I would just say that I think it's important not to focus too much on Taiwan as being a kind of motivating factor for the AUKUS arrangement. I think it's really important to bear in mind that Australia's geography is one of the most sort of maritime geographies of any country in the world. Australia is a huge island with a sort of vast terrain to cover. And added to that, Australia is also neighboured by islands. So the surrounding countries in the Pacific, in Southeast Asia are also archipelagic countries. And so that really, I think, makes the case for why the nuclear propulsion submarines are important to Australia, regardless of any kind of Taiwan contingency. And, added to that, I think the other factor that Ankit and Aaron, you've alluded to is that these submarines will not be acquired or built for a very long time. Whereas, of course, many China analysts suggest that Taiwan contingencies are realistic in a much shorter time frame. Now, of course, there is disagreement among China analysts and even among what we hear from different voices within the US military and defense establishment as to what the likely time frame for that will be. But certainly, I think it would not be reasonable for Australia or the United States to assume that these submarines would be directly relevant in a Taiwan contingency.
Yeah, let me just add a little bit to that. So I do agree, right? I mean, Prime Minister Morrison didn't get up there and say, this is all about Australia coming to the Taiwan fight. I mean, even though there are concerns in Canberra about what might happen in the Taiwan Strait in the coming years. But, I do want to say, I mean, the Defense Strategic Update and AUKUS, I think both speak to not only an expectation of the probability of high intensity conflict in the Indo-Pacific increasing, but also the need for Australia to have the capability to project power at longer ranges to deter primarily high intensity conflict near Australia. So the SSNs, I think, clearly fit into that sort of strategic rationale. I think the very kind of the forgotten everybody always, I think, forgets that Australia is a major Indian Ocean power, and that's certainly been a big feature of Australia's cooperation with India and within the aegis of the Quad. So comparatively, I mean, if we think about the advantages that Australia might have with an SSN capability in the Indian Ocean region, which I think has advantages in peacetime and possibly in a conflict that might begin in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. The rationale for these submarines, again, I think looks a lot better from that vantage point as well. But I think Susannah's right. This is not about Taiwan in the short term. If AUKUS were about Taiwan, I think we would see the long range strike component of it. The SSNs, I think, just given the timeframes involved and given the expectations of at least analysts do disagree in the non-governmental community, but in the governmental community here in the U.S., there is an expectation of increased tensions, coercion, possibly conflict in the Taiwan Strait in the 2020s or early 2030s. So I think we would see a different sort of reaction there. So I think this is more about meeting the demand signal from Australia for this technology for the reasons that Susannah described, and to really bring Australia closer fundamentally to the US in the long term.
Thanks for that. We have a few questions here. One's by Wesley Nickel, and it's touching on the Canadian, an aspect of Canada, and then perhaps use this also as well to talk about. Well, we touched a little bit on the French angle, but if you see an entry point to expand upon your comments on France, I recommend doing it here. So I'm just going to read Wesley's question. What does AUKUS mean for the Five Eyes intelligence alliance? Does AUKUS imply a tiered relationship between Five Eye countries? Should Canada have been part of AUKUS given the increasingly turbulent China-Canada relationship? And if not, why was Canada left out? Susannah, Ankit, whoever wants to go first, go ahead and take that. But I think one of the fundamental things here is looking at this about the, the export of high technology, which ultimately has never been exported, or at least the U.S. has sought not to export, which is propulsion technology. So maybe take it in that direction a little bit about treating allies a little differently. So whoever wants to take it first, go ahead.
Yeah, I can kick off here. So, yeah, I mean, I think the Five Eyes angle here is interesting. The way a Five Eyes is fundamentally an intelligence sharing agreement. I mean, there are close political relationships between the five countries, but fundamentally it's about having that intelligence fire hose, particularly on signals intelligence, open between the five countries, which is really an unprecedented kind of intelligence sharing that the U.S. really only does within that context, right? Even the debates about bringing Japan into Five Eyes or certain European countries like the Netherlands haven't gone too far because of the sensitivities there. And then within Five Eyes, I think we can see different relationships. New Zealand, of course, after the breakdown of the alliance with the United States, after New Zealand's own hesitancy about nuclear propulsion vessels and nuclear weapons in the 1980s, has been in sort of a different basket. I will just say, with Canada, I mean, if you look at the kind of collaboration the U.S. and Canada have on homeland missile defense more generally, I think you'll find a comparable, perhaps, relationship to AUKUS. I mean, the U.S.-Canada relationship is fundamentally close on a lot of those issues, even though the U.S. isn't going to be sharing nuclear propulsion technology with Australia. And so then Australia is in that new basket where nuclear propulsion technology will be shared. So I think we need to sort of be careful about conflating Five Eyes with a sort of defense industrial partnership between the five countries, because it's not that. It was never intended to be that. But I think, AUKUS will, like I said, in the context of Japan and South Korea, perhaps down the line create greater interest in Canada, particularly I think under a future conservative government in Canada, about trying to get some of these technologies from the United States. Canada is also increasingly more active in the Indo-Pacific, so then that provides a more compelling rationale. Canada actually did consider highly enriched uranium-based nuclear propulsion in the 1980s, but decided not to go forward with it. So there is a history there. But yeah, I guess those are my thoughts for the moment.
I think maybe just to add slightly to that, I think Ankit is right that the Five Eyes, I would really describe it more as an enabler for an arrangement like this, because it creates trust between the countries, and it also creates or means that there are easily established mechanisms for sharing sensitive information, which could possibly be used in this context as well. So I think that, certainly makes this type of an arrangement possible, but it doesn't necessarily make it logical or necessary for a country like Canada, let alone, of course, New Zealand being in a very different category.
Let me come to a question by Frank Hoffman. Ankit, it touches a little bit on what you were talking about with the non-proliferation. I mean, are we overstating the case? Are the people in the non-proliferation community kind of going above and beyond, and in some respects kind of enabling Beijing's talking points about this? And do the benefits from the conventional side perhaps outweigh the non-proliferation side? And if so, what does that suggest about the future going forward? Because I know there's been talk in our community about how non-pro gets tossed aside when there's, I guess, really pressing strategic rationale for moving forward with an agreement like this.
Yeah, I mean, look, so, in the hypothetical where AUKUS is just done without any regard to the non-proliferation consequences, I mean, my assessment is probably that we won't see the kind of worst case scenario cascade where, the Iranians have tried to use, naval propulsion as an excuse for enriching uranium. Would they go back to that? Would the Russians and the Chinese then support the Iranian effort to do that? Probably not. But, I think the concern here is that this would provide the basis for that kind of thing to happen. I mean, look, my analytical perspective that I think differs from some others in the non-proliferation community is that there's an opportunity here to use AUKUS to build on this, at least to plug the loophole on naval nuclear propulsion. That Australia, I think, has the potential here to really serve. And Australia has done this traditionally. It's actually a very traditional part of Australia's foreign policy to be forward-leaning on non-proliferation issues, on governance issues in the non-proliferation regime. So Canberra, the best possible outcome here is for Australia to acquire SSNs, which I think are an important capability, and do so in a way that strengthens the non-proliferation regime, right? I mean, it is, I think, from where I'm sitting, possible for Australia to have its cake, and for the international non-proliferation community to also have a slightly smaller cake that is perhaps not as delicious as the cake where Australia has conventional submarines, and we don't have to deal with this. But I think fundamentally it will be helpful to strengthen this. I mean, just looking at the landscape with submarine proliferation and sort of the rationale that other countries might come up with in the coming years for naval nuclear propulsion, I actually think there's an imperative here for the AUKUS countries to lead on this. And of course, that's very traditional. I mean, all of this is being justified through the lens of supporting the rules-based international order. So I think that would very much be in line with that effort. So I'm not quite a sort of maximalist pessimist on this, but I do think this, the concerns deserve to be taken seriously. Where I think it's hard for me to kind of come down on the conventional deterrence side is that until there's further detail, because I mean, when you're analyzing the benefits of any policy, you're really comparing trade-offs. Every policy has a trade-off, and so the trade-offs with AUKUS I think are clear, but it's difficult to sort of assess the conventional deterrence benefits of the ledger until we have more detail on that. So for the moment, I find the theory of the case on the non-proliferation side to be quite convincing, even though I'm not as pessimistic as some.
Susannah, I know you're not a non-pro expert. Do you have anything to add to that before I pivot to Australian domestic politics? No. So I want to ask you about Australian domestic politics. There are a couple questions in the chat about this. You know, what is the Australian domestic view of both nuclear powered vessels? And if there's a negative aspect of this, is that particularly salient in Australian domestic politics? Because the deal is so long in duration, basically from when you sign to when you agree on the submarine agreement to when you get first submarine in the water, we're looking at probably 20 years here. So how is this playing out in the Australian domestic view, both on like let's talk about the nuclear aspect, but also on the prospect of tying yourself to the United States and to a lesser degree, the United Kingdom moving forward?
Sure. Well, I think if you'd asked anyone in Australia how this would have played out domestically, say 5 years ago, there would have been a strong assumption that nuclear propelled submarines were not an option because of domestic political really antipathy to the idea of developing either a civilian nuclear industry or, of course, let alone nuclear weapons. And so in particular, the idea that you could have the nuclear propelled submarines without a civilian nuclear industry was also something that was considered to be a sort of a fact that was taken as a given in Australia. And so that really meant that it wasn't, I think, seriously considered for quite some time until now. But even so, I think because of the sort of the growing threat perception from China, which I mentioned in my earlier remarks, and I think also because of the way that this was announced, in the sense that it was already a done deal, the way it was presented, even though, of course, as Ankit has pointed out, there is much about this that is not a done deal and that remains to be seen. The way it was presented politically by the three leaders was that it was kind of a fait accompli. And so that meant that the Australian opposition party really more or less accepted the arrangement quite quickly. They set out a few provisos, you know, including that Australia had to adhere to its non-proliferation obligations, but there was no serious opposition. Now, a little bit later, the opposition did go a bit further in terms of saying that we need to maintain our sovereignty, our self-reliance, that this should not be compromised in the context of the AUKUS arrangement. And I guess that goes to the second part of your question, Aaron, which is sort of the attitudes towards relying on the US. And that has been the subject of quite considerable debate in Australia. And probably the strongest opposition to the AUKUS arrangement is from some voices within the sort of security analyst community who argue that the United States is basically going to be an unreliable partner for Australia because US commitment to Asia cannot be guaranteed, and therefore hitching our wagon to a capability that makes most sense when it's conceived of as part of a collective strategy rather than something that is purely for the defense of Australia doesn't make sense according to that school of thought. I think for now that is a minority view though, but of course as over 20 years, I suspect, a lot will change, both in terms of threat perceptions and also in terms of what we see about the evolving US role. And I think Australian attitudes will also evolve in that time.
Can I, and this is for both you, the original intent was to have a third panelist from the UK, but there was scheduling issues. But I'm going to put both of you on the spot. what's the UK role in here? We're talking a lot about the US and Australia. We had a question in the chat about the UK role. You know, what do they bring to this? Is it solely that they can, the ease with which they can provide some of these technologies in the way US domestic legislation says that we cannot, particularly around the export of certain nuclear technology items? How does the UK fit into this picture? Because there is a UK in the middle of AUKUS.
Well, it feels a little unfair to talk about the UK without a Brit here to potentially disagree. But in any case, yeah, I mean, so look, I mean, post-Brexit, you know, the UK has been looking for an autonomous role in global affairs through the Global Britain Aegis. It's been turning its attention to the Indo-Pacific, including with the carrier deployment that's ongoing right now. So AUKUS, I think, fits very neatly into that as a puzzle piece. It's an Anglo alliance. Australia and UK, of course, you know, very close partners historically there as well. So the logic of AUKUS, I think, makes a lot of sense. And then, you know, we can talk about the defense industrial component of that too, which is, you know, Rolls-Royce, which manufactures the naval propulsion units for British nuclear-powered submarines, has been hurting. So this is likely to lead to new business for them, which is, of course, I think something that the Johnson government will be quite happy with. It sidelines the French, but, you know, I think the relationship, I actually think that the UK-France relationship has taken the least amount of damage here out of the three AUKUS countries. So that's, I think, you know, just more of a tongue-in-cheek reflection more than anything. But I do think that, you know, I mean, fundamentally, this really does seem to be in line with a lot of what the Johnson government has tried to do. And I think it's, and, you know, for the United States, I think it's a way to get London just more long-term invested in these issues in the Indo-Pacific. You know, even if there's a change of government, I think the strategic rationale there would be quite strong, but AUKUS, I think, only ensures that the UK will be positively engaged in the Indo-Pacific in coming years.
I think that covered it pretty well.
Well, excellent. So the other questions I have is you know, the other part of the alliance, which is, was there a better way to handle this with the French? You know, because clearly there was a rupture. But I think less known was the aspects of the French-Australian submarine deal before the rupture. So Susannah, I may put you on the spot if you could talk a little bit about that history leading up to the rupture, and then perhaps maybe if it could have been handled better, or if not, how to pick up the pieces.
Well, the sort of the brief history was that it was not a really happy arrangement between Australia and France, and that the arrangement that Australia had with France to build 12 conventionally powered submarines had faced a lot of cost overruns and blowouts in the schedule. And so that, you know, it was clear, I think, that there was some frustration, and, you know, Australian officials are on the record from parliamentary proceedings earlier in the year as saying that we are, you know, undertaking the sort of the sensible plan B type planning that we should have in place given the challenges of this procurement. And I mean, a big part of that, which we haven't really discussed, is it goes to the question that Ankit has raised about defence industry. And of course, you know, all three countries, I think, have a strong political interest in wanting their own defence industries to benefit to the maximum extent possible. Certainly Australia, there's a big political driver to have a domestic shipbuilding industry. But there's a trade-off there in terms of building these boats in Australia ourselves, which is what we had asked for from the French, but it was proving, I think, quite challenging. So that is the context. Was there a way of handling it differently? I think probably yes. It could have been handled differently in a diplomatic sense. But ultimately, you know, what Australia will be hoping is that the same sort of strategic interests which have driven the French interest in the Indo-Pacific will ultimately prevail and mean that, you know, in the long term, the kind of cooperation between Australia and France, and also in different sort of minilateral groupings, including the US as well. Countries like India and Japan will get back on track because France obviously is a really substantive player in the Pacific in particular, and it is important to have that relationship in a much better footing.
I'll just add a few thoughts to that. To completely, don't diverge anywhere with what Susannah said. I mean, just to reflect a little bit though on why the French were so angry and jilted. I think, the scope of French anger here, I think, is important to understand because France has seen their defense industry lose major agreements. They lost a major agreement with India, for instance, to develop a range of fighters, which was later followed up by a smaller agreement. But, that wasn't the end of the French-India defense industrial partnership, or didn't result in ambassadors being withdrawn. Defense industrial cooperation is fundamentally transactional. So I do think there was a way for Australia to be very honest with the French and simply end this as a transaction and indicate potentially that they were going to open a new competitive process or a tender, or potentially reassess the need for nuclear propulsion submarines first and then arrive at AUKUS. That, of course, didn't happen. We had an August 30th, French-Australian 2+2 meeting where in the joint statement, the two sides indicated how much they supported the submarine project. And then on September 13th, we got the AUKUS announcement, which was apparently just followed up by a phone call to the French from the American side, letting them know that something was up. And then, of course, you see the three leaders of the three countries announcing this together. And I think that really, enhanced the sort of humiliation that the French faced here. And I think explains a lot of the French anger. The right way to do it, I think, would have been for Australia to independently inform the French of the fact that this transaction was no longer viable, and then arrive at AUKUS, at least making it seem like this wasn't something that the three countries really dreamed up behind the backs of the French. But of course, it's too late now, and repairing this relationship, I think, will take some time. Regaining that trust, especially, I think, is going to be difficult. But like I said in my original remarks, I think it's going to be interesting to see what this does longer term to that sort of intra-French debate about how French should be engaging with the United States as it pivots itself towards the Indo-Pacific more broadly. Because I think I can see the case now for the French pivoting fundamentally more towards autonomy, potentially even supporting a greater role for the European Union more directly in the region, cooperating more with Germany. So it'll be interesting to see in the coming months how that debate plays out in Europe.
So I'm going to ask the last question here, and we have 7 minutes. And one thing we do at FPRI, at least when I moderate, is we finish on time. You've used the P word now, Ankit. The P word is pivot, which Obama announced when, in 2009? Was it 2009 or 2008? My point is, it's been well over a decade since the announcement, whatever year it was. Susannah, you've mentioned a few times that the broader long-term Australian domestic debate isn't necessarily about the alliance with the US, it's whether the US will remain invested in the Indo-Pacific moving forward. Where does the pivot go from here? And these will probably be the last words. So Ankit, do you want to go first? Susannah, you'll finish us off, and then I'll wrap up.
Well, I've been wondering about the timing of the AUKUS announcement because it didn't have to happen when it did, right? I mean, it was between the global reaction to the catastrophe in Afghanistan, which the Biden administration defended itself against by saying, look, we're ending these wars. We're going to fundamentally actually do what our predecessors tried to do and turn our attention to the Indo-Pacific. And it happened right before the Quad Leaders Summit, too, which, of course, the Quad being a very different forum. So it's interesting to sort of see this major strategic initiative indicating long-term U.S. Involvement, engagement in the Indo-Pacific, shoring up allied capability coming right after the Afghanistan withdrawal. I think that probably wasn't an accident. I think it's a way for the administration to show that, they are going to put the rubber to the road finally on pivoting to the Indo-Pacific, so to speak. But ultimately, when you look at the broader picture, like I talked about earlier with what the US is doing with South Korea, Japan, to increase allied capabilities, being more frank and engaged with partners on concerns about the Taiwan Strait in very explicit terms, mentioning Taiwan in joint statements and so forth. I think we're seeing a very different kind of Indo-Pacific approach from this administration. I think it's actually building on a lot of what the Trump administration did end up doing, at least at the bureaucratic level at DOD and so forth, where a lot of cooperation, especially with Australia, a lot of that cooperation continued. The alliances with Japan and South Korea were, of course, a lot rockier. So there is a degree of continuity here, but the sort of cohesive theory that the Biden administration, I think, is presenting for the way in which it's engaging the Indo-Pacific is fundamentally, I think, oriented around allies and shoring up allied capability while building political coalitions. Where I think the Biden administration, the Trump administration, and the Obama administration really, I think, missed the boat a little bit is in recognizing that the major demand signals from the Asia-Pacific region, or the Indo-Pacific region more broadly, primarily outside allied states, is for the U.S. to be engaged as a geoeconomic player. And of course, with the U.S. still being outside CPTPP, RCEP, and really all of these major arrangements, there is a huge gap there. There is, of course, some focus within the Quad, bilaterally, trilaterally, to compete with China's Belt and Road by offering infrastructure and development funding. But again, I don't see really the U.S. having a symmetric advantage there against China. So the big picture, I think, I guess the big question is whether we're going to see the Biden administration come up with a geoeconomic approach to the region that does fundamentally offer something that will meet these regional demand signals.
Susannah, last word to you.
Yeah, so when the Australian Prime Minister was in the US a couple of weeks ago, before his meeting with President Biden, he said something along the lines of, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, you get it. So it was kind of high praise there. And I think that really reflects kind of from an Australian perspective that the AUKUS arrangement is a really kind of strong and positive signal. But I would really echo what Ankit said about the economic side, because we know that when it comes to the peacetime competition for influence, especially in Southeast Asia, the economic side is much more important than the security side, because it tends to be economic issues that are really the sort of driving priority for most countries, especially recovering from COVID-19 and all the rest of it. The kind of infrastructure approach that the Trump administration, or that sort of came to pass during the Trump administration in little bits and pieces, is just very ineffective. There really is no substitute for a trade-based, comprehensive approach to economic competition in the region. And unfortunately, given the domestic political challenges that this poses, that really does mean a return to the CPTPP or something like it. And so I think that really does underscore a pretty major question mark for allies like Australia and for others about US capability in terms of economic statecraft as well as military statecraft.
Well, with that, I want to thank both of you. This was a really in-depth conversation touching on all sorts of things, from submarine to long-range strike, finishing off with TTP, and managing alliances across really a huge swath of territory. The Pacific is so large. It's really great to engage with experts who can walk us through that important region. And I would say one of the great things about the pivot, and it's bad for my business as somebody who focuses on sort of Europe, Southern Europe, and the Middle East, is more conferences in California and Hawaii once we can get this pandemic behind us. I will be more blunt in my sending out of the bat signal. FPRI is really interested in engaging with people who don't necessarily engage with us. So people who attended this event who don't know about FPRI, we don't blame you, but we want you to know more about us. So head on over to fpri.org, check out our work. And if you want to become a member to attend different types of briefings, more high-level briefings with smaller group settings where we can all interact with each other rather than using the Q&A function, please think about supporting us. And I want to again thank our two panelists, Ankit and Susannah. Please check out their work. And with that, have a nice day, have a nice afternoon, or have a nice evening, depending on where you are. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks.